progress? Perfect. Thank you. And just letting everyone know, we also have Louise joining us online. So this feels like a little bit of a homecoming for everyone who hasn't met Jenny. And I know Anne is going to do an introduction soon, but is the most fabulous person ever, Jenny. So it's lovely to have you back in the room. So congratulations to whoever made the first phone call email to Jenny and got her back in the room. That's awesome. So over to you, Anne.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. I think you've essentially done the introduction for me, but I will just introduce Roger Morrison, who's been with us for 4 weeks. 5 weeks. Roger is our new community grants advisor. He sits in Margot's team. I think a lot of you have met Margot Wilson before as well. She was our community connector and now is our community advisor team leader. So Roger and Margot have been really working on this grants funding framework with Jenny. So yeah, I'm just here for the introductions and I'm going to keep it really short. And like I said, you've done the best introduction already. So I'm just going to pass over to Jenny and Kirsten and I'll leave these guys to it.
Thank you, Anne. Are you okay for me to just go? Wonderful. Thank you so much. And thank you very much for the opportunity to do some work with Napier City Council again. I have worked for the council I started my first job with the council about 20 years ago and was heavily involved with the redevelopment of McLean Park. Fundraising to get the new stand, and then Christine and I both did the MTG project together, and then various other bits and pieces for Barbara and Neil along the way. So it's really nice to be back here again. And I have Christine Ennis with me, my colleague. Christine and I have worked together for a long time in the fundraising space. So we're here today to really hear from you, and I want to sort of set the scene around what's happening in the fundraising world. So just for a bit of context, I do live in Hawke's Bay, but I spend half my time out of Hawke's Bay. I have and work with a wide range of organisations across the country. I've now secured over 225 million for projects across New Zealand, big projects and small projects, and do a lot of work with local government, helping them get money in for large infrastructure projects, but also helping them review their grants process. So we've been doing this with a number of councils around New Zealand, and I have a capability building company to try and help those smaller organisations that tend to have a heavy reliance on gaming trust or council funding and go back to council every single year and not looking anywhere else. So we're trying to help build capability in the not-for-profit sector so organisations can look for a range of funders rather than just always focusing on council. So today we're here to talk about your funding framework, and we are in the process of coming up with some options for what you might consider moving forward. But before I start into the questions around the funding framework, I just wanted to talk to you about what the New Zealand fundraising environment is like at the moment, because I'm conscious that you're based in Napier, but actually I wanted to give you a broader outline about what's happening around the country. So first of all, there are lots of challenges post-COVID. Main one being that central government put a lot of money into projects across New Zealand, and that money has now been used and there's very little funds going anywhere. So if you listen to the media on a regular basis, you'll be hearing lots of organisations, whether they're environmental, from the environmental sector, social service groups, arts, sports, etc., are all saying our funding has been dropped, and that's the reality out there. So there's more organisations looking for a smaller range of funding. Oh, sorry, forgetting to move my slide. Sorry, Tim. And the second thing to say is that, so that's happening. There was a huge increase in charities that when people were in COVID and thinking about buying dogs and things like that and doing online shopping, they're also thinking about starting new charities. So there has been an increase in the number of not-for-profits we have in New Zealand throughout the COVID period, which is also a bit of a problem because often there's a lot of duplicated services out there. So it's something else to sort of say. Cost of living crisis is having an impact everywhere in terms of individual giving. And we know here in Hawke's Bay the impact of the cyclone. So that's sort of what's happening. In terms of funding sources available in New Zealand, up until sort of the last month, New Zealand Lottery Grants Board have been down 46% on funds across New Zealand, which is massive. So that's particularly been in the Community Facilities Fund and the Environment and Heritage Fund. And they're currently doing a review of how much money they're going to have and what their distribution looks like, kind of like what you're doing. And it is highly likely that the Significant Projects Fund is no longer going to be available, which is a big issue if you're a council looking for infrastructure funding. So Significant Projects Fund has put money into obviously Napier assets, so that's likely to go. The money, and so in the last month, Lottery Grants Board funding has increased slightly, but that's just to be cautious about the fact that there's been less to distribute across the country. Secondly, Class 4 gaming sector under immense strain. So they have less funds to distribute, more organisations looking for funding. What's typically happening now when organisations are making an application into Class 4, if they are successful, they are either getting a small amount than they have applied for, or they're having to put applications in 2 or 3 times before they're successful. Generally, that's what's happening in that space. Central government has pulled back, and we've got a new government, as you all know, with a different philosophy to distributing funds. On a positive note, in the philanthropic and in the corporate space, interestingly, in terms of large philanthropists, money is still circulating around New Zealand. People are still interested in putting money into projects, and also businesses are still doing a lot of that work. I mean, last year, I had raised 16 million for a philanthropic project from people, not from government or central government. So there's still money floating around, but it's harder to get. And I think it's fair to say in places like provincial New Zealand, the amount of philanthropic funding is limited. It generally sits in Auckland.
Can I ask a question on that?
Yes.
Is that because they're more discerning about what they're contributing to, or?
I think that's a really good question. I think in terms of the fact that more money gets distributed in Auckland, there's a greater mass of people up there, probably the wealth is slightly higher than it is here. We have had in Hawke's Bay traditionally a really strong philanthropic culture for a long, long time. So if I compare Hawke's Bay to other regions around New Zealand that aren't so philanthropic, you are in a good region for philanthropy. What's happening now in terms of philanthropic contributions? Corporates and individuals are looking for impact. So when they're looking at whether or not they're going to distribute funds, they want to understand what is the return on investment, what is the impact that this is going to have into the community, and how is that being measured and articulated back. So if you've got a really good compelling case for investment, and if you can demonstrate impact, you're more likely, I should say, to have success. So I would say in Hawke's Bay there is still philanthropic money floating around for sure. But it's got to be for the right cause, and you've got to be able to articulate what you do well. And also in the corporate space, money is still flowing around. So businesses are still wanting to contribute back to community projects, but they need to be really clear that if they're going to invest money, it's going to deliver a return. The other thing that's happening on top of all the other sort of tightening around funding is that local government is having to look at, what are they distributing? You all know that there's limited funds to distribute, and there's a big pull on the call for funds. I think the other thing to say is that most councils around New Zealand also need to get their own external funding for infrastructure projects. So, you're under immense pressure. There's pressure from the communities, and sometimes it's also about managing expectations, particularly for... Oh, thanks. I'm still on this one. Yep. Particularly for councils that have had expectations where they've funded organisations for years and years and years, and it's been kind of historic or habitual funding, and actually sometimes this not-for-profit groups in the community sort of sit around and think, well, actually we've always had money from this particular council that will just carry on forever. But the reality is that that's not the case. You can't work like that anymore. So I think when we've been working with councils, what we're hearing back is councils are trying to understand what outcomes are going to be delivered and met if you are going to be giving funding. And that's become much tighter than it has been previously, which I personally think is a really good thing. So where it's been historical and there's been long associations, a lot of councils are now saying, well, actually, is that delivering us a good return on investment or not? So in terms of what other councils are doing, so what they're doing at the moment is they're reviewing their distributions, looking at historical grants, asking about transformation. So just so that you know, a whole lot of other funders beyond council are looking for impact and transformation as well. So if you think about Eastern and Central Community Trust, or if you think about some of the other private trusts we have in New Zealand, places like lotteries, most funders are now saying, we'll put an impact lens across any application that comes through, and we want to understand what transformation is being made.
Jenny, could you give me an example of that?
Yeah, so in terms of, if I think about Eastern and Central Community Trust, they're really looking at how they do their funds distribution. They're really trying to understand that if they're going to give money for a particular project, it has to deliver transformation in their community. And what I mean by transformation, and probably what they would mean about transformation, is how is it impacting lives? So is it youth transformation? Are you providing a service or a facility that's going to generate enhanced well-being? Are you going to provide a facility that's going to enable kids to participate in sport, and that's going to have a whole lot of extra benefits? So you have transformation is important. You can't, they're now sort of saying we're not just going to give money to not-for-profits simply because they exist. They have to be delivering really good value back to the communities. So that's the lens that's been put across. If I think about this as sort of not necessarily Hawke's Bay based, but if I think about Trust Waikato, they have now got what they call an impact lens across every application that goes through, and lots of the other community trusts are doing that. And it's certainly, if you think about the narrative that's coming out of central government, it is about transformation and impact.
And is that a kind of one-off, or is that something that every year you'd be reapplying for that fund for transformation?
Every fund, most of the funds are slightly different. So some funds will give you funding for 2 or 3 years, but most funds are on an annual basis. And they're really sort of saying to community groups, if you're putting your application forward, you know, for instance, if you've existed since 1952 and you have X number of members and you've been in your community for a long time, that's great, but that's not necessarily transformation. What is a transformation that you're actually contributing to in your community is what's going to help you get the money across the line, rather than the fact that you've existed for 50 years. So it's that sort of stuff. So that's really important. I think the other thing too that councils are looking for now is they are looking at long-term partnerships with clear accountability. So really wanting to understand, move to a partnership model as opposed to a one-off financial transaction model, which is actually, I think, better for the not-for-profit organisation, and it's better for councils as well. You want to get into a partnership rather than just kind of financial transactions. Some councils are looking at reducing grants because it's a financial reality. A lot of councils we work with are sort of saying, well, actually, we're going to help build capability in the community to help organisations become more successful themselves, so they're not coming back to rely on council all the time, and wanting to see diverse funding plans, and that council's part of the mix, not necessarily just the sole funder. And other councils are saying, well, we're just going to stick with what status quo is. So in terms of the current situation here with Napier City Council, I don't want to be too brutal, but I think what we would say is that in terms of the recent review that's come out of council funding, is that it's not necessarily fit for purpose. There's a lot of anomalies that are going on. Impact is not necessarily anything that has been kind of assessed when looking at looking across some of the applications. I think it's fair to say that impact is not necessarily a key driver for distribution in some of the grants. And I think the other thing that's sort of come out of the review, which we didn't do, but an independent review that you've had, is that it can be quite unnecessarily onerous for people making applications. So you've got to think about the time and effort it takes to get, say, $500 or $1,000 and sort of decide, is that really good use of either your money and their time. So the other thing that I would also say is that there seems to be a lack of transparency and accountability around where funds are being distributed. And there seems to be, from what we've read and what the report says, is that there's sort of a bit of an equity in terms of where funds go. And I'm going to go through each of the funds with you to sort of explain that in more detail. So that's sort of kind of what's happening. I'll quickly whip through just to remind you about the community grants and the funds you've got going at the moment. So I'll just whip through this and give you a quick overview. So you have the community development grants that you distribute, which is about sort of fostering, using community development approach to foster social wellbeing. It's a non-contestable fund and it's open throughout the year, so there's no contestability around that. Applications are assessed internally and peer reviewed for a funding decision, and they're small grants from $2,000 to $5,000. It's been an underutilised fund in recent years, so it hasn't been fully allocated. You might also could possibly also say possibly organisations don't even know that some organisations don't know it exists.
I think you don't know who gets them either.
We don't know who gets them.
Who got them.
No, so I think that's with a lot of the funds. You're right, Councillor Bogut said that a lot of the funds are, there's not a lot of transparency around who receives what. So it's kind of a little bit hidden. The other fund that you've got is the Community Services Grant Fund, which again is back out to community and voluntary organisations. It is a contestable fund, so it differs from the other community grant fund. It's contestable. Again, very small amounts of funding, so from $1,000 to $4,000. And there's been an increase of 25% in this particular fund. And this fund also includes rate subsidies that are available to not-for-profit organisations, and you get around about 7 applications per year. So they're quite similar funds, but the way that they're handled is very different, so there's a lot of inconsistency there.
This one also is publicised on our website. Who's got what?
And this one, yes, they will say who's got what. So there's, that they essentially deliver to similar groups, but they're inconsistent.
But that just a little bit confusing. The 7 applications are for rate subsidies. Because there's about 60 applications.
Yeah. Sorry for the rate. For the rate rebate. Yeah.
Jenny, just looking at the volume, the money, is there across in your experience, across the grants that you're familiar with,
Yes.
is there a baseline that demonstrates that the contribution in financial terms is actually effective? In other words, if we're paying an organisation $500, what can you get today for $500? And should we be looking at what effect we're generating?
Yes, it's a really great question. Thank you. I haven't seen any kind of stats or data or valuation around what that magic number might be. But in my observation and the work that I do, what I would say is that receiving $1,000 is not going to change the dial for a not-for-profit. That's a generalisation. There may be exceptions to that, but for the work that you go through to get your $1,000 and where that can go and how far you can spread that over a 12-month period is really limited. So I think that's something for consideration for council, whether you have a smaller number of organisations that are funded more and you can really look at transformation and they can deliver something. You'd have to argue for $1,000, what would that investment return look like? It's hard to imagine that if you spend $1,000, there's going to be massive transformation. But in terms of that magic number, I haven't ever seen anything on that.
Because it's that balancing act between
Yes.
are we sustaining an organisation or
Yes.
are we delivering community good outcome?
Yeah, well, I think that's a really interesting consideration, because another thing that I would add to that is that if you've got a not-for-profit that's scrambling around trying to find $1,000, and if they don't get that $1,000, they could potentially fall over, you'd have to look at the ongoing viability. And I certainly think that that's what funders are doing at the moment. They're really sort of saying, okay, if we're going to give you an investment, it actually needs to be part of a significant part of a wider mix. And I know funders out there that are saying, look, we're not going to give you $2,000 or $3,000 because actually that's not going to make a difference. So it's not a good use of our money. We're actually going to give another organisation $10,000 or whatever it might be because we're going to get a better return on our investment. So yeah, it's definitely part of the consideration.
Sorry, can I just ask a question there? Wouldn't the smaller amounts play a role if you're going off to different providers who aren't giving you the full amount? So if you go to the gaming and you only get 3,000 instead of 6, and you come to council and get 1,000, you're working your way to be able to do something. Does that play a role in there?
It does play a role. So certainly funders are wanting to see other funders at the table, to your point. So, if you are going to apply, if you're going to apply to, the Lion Foundation, ideally they want to see that they're not the only funder there. I think so you're right, diversified funding is really important. Particularly, they also want to see, have you gone out to the philanthropic community? Have you gone out to the business community, etc.? So it's part of that jigsaw puzzle. I guess where I would caution, I guess where the difference is there is that $1,000 is not going to change the dial, but generally speaking, there needs to be a mix of funders at the table. But if you're kind of going and you're looking for $5,000 and you're getting $1,000 from council and $1,000 from somewhere else, that's not going to make a significant difference to the organisation. So if you were looking to raise $20,000 for your organisation and you were getting $5,000 from council or $10,000 for council, that's more likely going to have a bigger return on your investment. So yeah, that's. I think if you're all, be careful how I say this, because you've got to be, for small groups that are sort of running around trying to find $10,000 every year. There's not a lot of sustainability in that. Sorry, I'll go back. Actually, I've got a bit ahead of myself. Sorry, just back to the talking through your current community grants. So you'll know that you've got your council projects fund. So this is the fund that you as councillors have a sort of say in terms of distribution. So this is really for organisations that don't fit the other two funds. They don't fit the criteria. It's a discretionary fund that's available throughout the year, and it's it's assessed via a council through into paper. So and funds typically be between $20,000 and $30,000. Then you also have your service agreements. So these are agreements go out to a range of organisations, and these tend to be slightly larger amounts of funding, and you have them set in there for 3 years. I should just point out here that they are non-contestable. So what that means is that other organisations in the community at the moment can't come and be part of that. So it's not contestable. So the same organisations get funded every year for 3 years at a time. So it's an important thing to remember, they're non-contestable. They are invited by council to submit a process, and they're set there for 3 years, and there's currently 9 service agreements in place. They tend to be, some of them are historical.
Just on that point, obviously at the end of the 3 years, they should become contestable, each one of those individual agreements. The question is, what's our habits been in the past? Have we simply rolled them over and renewed the contracts, or have we actually seriously looked at the outcome?
My understanding is, and I'm really happy to be corrected here if I've interpreted this incorrectly, is that they tend to be rolled over, and I don't know, I'm not clear from looking at the review that there has been a really in-depth review about return on investment and the impact that has been delivered back to the community, but I'm happy for somebody else from council to maybe talk to that. I don't know.
What you're saying is correct.
Yeah, which is kind of a bit of a concern,
They have to reapply and provide reports on what they're doing and stuff.
But it's that age-old question, if they're the only ones that know.
Yeah.
I think that's the issue. If they're the only ones that know, and if they are, and if it's kind of historical and they just tick over. And I suppose it's, as councillors, it's, are you comfortable that money is going to these particular organisations? And it could be that they're doing a fantastic job and they are, they're really delivering great service back to the community. It's just, it would probably be useful for you to know if that's the case or not. And just some much smaller grants I'll just quickly whip over is around the arts and culture grants that are currently available. So specifically for the arts and culture sector, that sit underneath the arts policy. Again, applications are assessed by a panel of council and community representatives. There's 50,000 in that, and it's another fund that has been underutilised. So only 34% of it has been distributed in the last 2022-23 year. So I glean from that possibly organisations may not necessarily know that fund is actually out there and available to be accessed.
It is for public art.
Yeah, for public art. Yeah.
Councillor Brown?
Is that the one that's not our money?
No.
No.
Creative communities.
Yeah.
No.
That's creative communities. This is still ratepayer money, yeah. There's a youth development grant, and I understand that's been increased in the LTP, youth development grant.
Yes.
Into 2 different grants. Contestable fund, again, and these are for very kind of small amounts of funding. So you can see that 7,000 was awarded to 15 people in the 2022-23 financial year, so the smaller amounts of funding. The other thing that's kind of interesting, and I haven't seen this before with other councils I've worked with, is that the council actually manages bequests, three bequest funds, and distributes the interest of these bequests, and they are small amounts of money, and they go to sort of things like school prizes and Christmas community lunch and sort of smaller things. So it's been very minimal, less than $1,000 being distributed recently. So that's a kind of probably a historical thing that council's been probably landed with those bequests. And there's more. So council also, so you're sort of getting a picture that there's a lot going on in terms of council funds and distribution. There's also money that is distributed for economic development, for events, for cultural events. So these are, and we're not reviewing the events or commenting on that. That's sort of outside of scope, so we won't get into that, but that's something else for you to think about. But we're also looking in terms of our scope, we are looking in terms of economic development grants, and we're looking at Te Waka Rangipo and what they're distributing back out. So that'll be part of what we come back on. I also presume that you've got some sort of in-kind sponsorship that happens when council helps with sort of managing traffic and venue hire and things like that. I've got this highlighted, which is the Keep Napier Beautiful grants that also get distributed for under $500. So another one that is out there. So you've got a lot of grants going on. I think that's what we would say. A lot of grants going on, possibly not a lot of transparency around how they're distributed. And to Councillor Bogue's point, often people don't know what, they don't know necessarily that the funds are there, but they also don't know where the money's gone to. So, and there's probably not a lot of accountability. So given all of that, I'm keen to sort of now ask you some questions, if that's okay. And so what we want to make sure that we're doing in terms of recommendations for the framework is we want to make sure that we are really bringing you along with us, and we're really hearing from you as councillors as to what you want to see and what your views are in terms of considering the distribution of grants. So I'll run through some of the things that you need to consider. First thing to say is you don't have any legal or statutory requirements to provide grants. But if you do want to continue distributing your grants, you need to be mindful of Local Government Act, I suppose, and the disbursements of grants around your strategic planning and meeting the requirements of the Local Government Act. So that's the first thing to say. So you don't have to, but make sure when you are doing it, you are cognizant of the Local Government Act. The other thing to say is sort of, I think it's really important when you're thinking about where money is going to go and the impact that you're wanting to have with ratepayer money is making sure that any distribution of fund actually aligns to your strategic priorities. So that's the first starting point. So your council visual is enabling places and spaces where everyone wants to be, making sure that you are cognizant of that when you're thinking about where money goes. So really aligning the distribution to the strategic priorities of council. And of course, you have got your 5 strategic priorities. You all know what they are. I think these should be, and when you're looking at assessment and where funds go, they need to be, I would encourage you to be thinking about any distribution needs to be able to demonstrate how that particular funding is going to align to you achieving as a council your strategic priorities. So that's really important.
It needs to go in the application form.
Absolutely.
Not in the assessment.
Totally. And so what we're going to do as part of the framework is we'll sort of give you some suggestions about what needs to be in terms of assessment, and I think that's absolutely right, and it's not dissimilar to what Lottery have in terms of their strategic priorities. It's certainly very consistent with what central government have for their funding, is that how is any application aligning to what the priorities are. So it's kind of 101, but it's not happening at the moment. So some of the other key principles to consider, so these are sort of quite big questions, but let's run through them. I guess what we're trying to get is a bit of a feel from you today, and we can come back with recommendations, but is there a desire for council to change the distribution of funds or stay with the current status quo?
I think we need to have another look at it all.
I think it needs a review.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think the review's shown us that we should.
Cool. The next question down is a bigger question: do you want to continue to grant the same quantum of funds?
You mean, is that the total or the way it's distributed?
The total rather than the distribution.
What is the total?
The total was recently approved in the 3-year plan.
Oh, so that's gone through LTP, so that's ticked off. Okay, that's fine. Yeah,
done.
so more about the amount rather than how it's sort of distributed across funds. The next question is really around, and you can see there's a lot of inconsistency with the current situation, is do you want to have the same number of funding rounds per year or increase the number of funding rounds? And I'll just talk to that briefly if I can. At the moment, there are funds that organisations apply to once a year, and then you've got your levels of service agreements, which is once every 3 years, and then you've got these kind of funds that aren't contestable at all, that people can kind of knock on your door and approach you. one of the things that you might want to consider is streamlining that. And so it's really clear to your community when they apply, how often they can apply, and what the rules are around that. And part of that, you might want to think about whether you maybe have 2 funding rounds per year. And the reason I say that is that a lot of other funders also fund throughout the year. And if they miss out on funding at the beginning of the year, it might be really good to be able to come back in 6 months' time and reapply again. So that's something to sort of think about, but just sort of putting it out for you to give some feedback on that.
One of our funds, I think it's the Council Projects Fund, which is open all of the year. That was set up with the desire for when people come to us with amazing ideas, but there's time pressure.
Yes.
A lot of the time there was some flexibility to consider it outside of those. I know a lot of the other ones have structured sort of application processes. So, I mean, my personal preference is to keep some sort of hybrid where you could still accommodate for things of interest to council that they want to support throughout the year.
For those that sit underneath that particular fund.
Yeah, and not necessarily keeping that same criteria, but just, I think there was benefit in that, and we did see that in a couple of years it was utilised in that way, and that was helpful. Councillor Greg.
Yeah, I think streamlining it and simplifying it as much as possible. I mean, because I don't understand it and I'm on council. I really don't get it. So I think it could do with a massive overhaul. Yeah.
Councillor Crystal. Oh, sorry, and then Councillor Simpson.
We already do the creative arts twice a year. So, and I know we only do the community grants once a year. I do know it's when you're on there that it's actually quite a lot of work and a lot of reading to do, but I think the twice a year, I haven't been on the creative arts for quite a long time, just gives people that have an idea or have an event, but it's not they can't get it in time for this one, so they get it for the next one. So I think that works really well for that kind of, because I know as a community, the people that come to us, a lot of them are completely nervous and so about doing it, but they've got a great idea. And so, sometimes it takes them quite a while to get it onto paper and into us.
I think that's right. And I think the other thing that happens is if they have a plan for a sort of a 12 or 24-month plan, depending on what they're trying to do, is that they may need to get money from somewhere else to help their application be more successful with you. So sometimes if it's just once a year, they only then they have to wait another 12 months when they've, and sometimes if they've secured money from another funder, they have to spend it within a certain period of time. So timing is kind of quite important around,
Councillor Simpson.
Yeah, further to Deputy Mayor's point, I think we have to look at the value add, and for us, value add is actually internal cost. Administer the funds. We're dealing with very small ad hoc applications. We have to say, well, what is the cost to us to actually deliver that service? Is it more economical to bundle timeframes together and put that overhead cost into a single application round, rather than every time somebody makes an application have to turn around and say, well, here we go again, we've got to re-enter this process, because again, that affects people's work programs. So, I think we have to be mindful, and it would be actually quite interesting to understand what the overhead cost of delivering the grant services are.
Yes, and I don't know if that any work's been analysis been done on that, Margot. No, it possibly hasn't, has it? It wasn't part of the review, I don't think. And Margot, yes, Margot and Roger and you.
No.
Yes.
But I mean, it's just about value add. If we're giving away small amounts, what is that actually costing us to deliver?
And I wonder if there's an opportunity to do a bit of both. I wonder if there's an opportunity where you sort of look at how much you are distributing, and that's another question I'm going to have coming up. But whether you maybe you might decide to distribute more to a smaller number of groups, so you can. That might be an option, and then so that could be another option. But it might be that you do need to have, and that might happen once or twice a year. But if you're distributing larger amounts of money, you might be able to. That will give you potentially. I think it has the opportunity to deliver more impact back to the community. But the other thing I would say is, things happen and opportunities pop up, and sometimes it is quite nice to have that little bit of flexibility. So it might be that you keep one fund, maybe that is that council fund that can be a fund that organisations can come to council with. The only thing I'd say to that, I suppose, if the flip side of that is that I think from a funding perspective, if an organisation hasn't got a funding plan for 12 months, my view is harshly, they're probably unorganised, but then opportunities do arise.
But I think further to your point earlier about some of our processes is the complication or the requirement of the applicant. You know, there could be a case of us saying we need different processes. In other words, instead of using the same process, if it's a smaller amount, actually it's just a tick and flick rather than a massive review and concept. Whereas when we get to the larger funds, it's about that. What is our cost to deliver a $30,000 grant, you know?
Yes, yes. You know, that's a good point.
Councillor
Yeah, we have streamlined the application process tremendously with the Smarty Grants, which has come with all sorts of issues and problems that haven't been ironed out yet either. But it used to be that applications for community development grants, for example, went through 2 staff members for full, you know, peer assessment and a whole assessment that was given to us. And then we'd get these great big books of, you know, that we had to go through that spent months going through them. But Smarty Grants has streamlined that a lot. So even if you're applying for a small amount, it's not such an onerous process for staff or for the applicants. So there is some improvement there. There's still room for more in terms of the actual wording of those Smarty Grants applications and assessments.
Councillor Crystal.
And just to follow on, when you were talking about the Council Projects Fund, we've tended to fund big projects, often start up almost ideas or
Seed funding.
Or even things, one comes to mind when we first came on council was the blow carts, building the track for them, things like that. So it's not that the groups aren't organised, it's more that they need a significant chunk of money to get the project underway or to get something done. So
more about opportunities, you're saying?
Yeah,
yes.
yeah. And
okay, that's good to know.
fund kind of sits, or I see where that. Yeah.
Yes, which would give you the flexibility as a council to sort of say, hey, we want to get in behind and back this and help these all. Yeah, okay. No, that's great. Is there any other feedback or any other things we need to consider in terms of that question?
Councillor Grigg.
It's just the feeling I have that sometimes it seems like people are using council as a bank rather than, you know, like actually having that delayed gratification and waiting a few months, like you say. And I don't know, should we be teaching people to come and harassing us every 5 minutes for $1,000? I just don't know if it's a good use of staff time.
They don't do
that.
There's some feedback in there.
Yeah.
That's feedback. Sorry. It's just a feeling.
Yes. Yeah. I hear what you're saying. Yes. Yes. The next question I've got is that, and this is something that I think is really important and will probably be a factor for how we sort of move forward in terms of what you're going to do in the framework is, do you want to introduce some sort of impact measurement across the funds? Do you want to start asking organisations to really demonstrate the impact that they're having?
I think in alignment with our strategic priorities, it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
I think it depends on the size of the grant and the size of the organisation. There are some small organisations who are actually organising events they're saving the council a huge amount of money because there's no staff input. They use the money, they have enormous volunteer input and have a very successful event. But if you've got to have a whole lot of other time spent that professionals would do better than volunteers afterwards, I don't know whether that would work or not, but I'm very much in favour of the small grants because they actually expand tremendously when volunteers are putting in a huge amount of time to do a community-based event or project.
I think the thing around what this could look like in terms of impact measurement, to your point, Councillor Bogue, I think the level of information you would require would depend on the amount that's being distributed. But I do still think if you're getting a small amount of money and you have got a group of volunteers, you can weave a story around impact around that. You know, you can weave a story around the impact that the benefit it has on the volunteers by being associated with something. It's almost about how do you teach these organisations to tell their stories better and talk about their impact. But they're not going to have the funds to get a professional in to help them do that. But I think something around kind of what what are we doing, why are we doing it, and why this is important is probably useful. But then for larger grants, it probably needs to be more in depth. But anyway, look, that's up to you, but that's sort of
my understanding, just bouncing off what Councillor Bogue's saying, is we're not saying that we won't do small grants potentially if they can show the impact from it. So we assess on the impact. So in a situation like what you're saying, where it's multiplied hugely because of the volunteer association, it's got a huge community impact, for instance, and that is the impact measure.
Yes,
which is appropriate.
Yes, yes, that's right. I didn't articulate that very well. That's exactly what I was sort of trying to say. Yes. I think the other thing just on that, just in terms of how these organisations, teaching them how to do that and building their capability around this is not just beneficial for what's happening for council, but it also will help them build their capability for other applications that they're going to be doing, because other funders are going to want to see that as well.
And that was what I was just going to jump in and say with the Community Development Fund. Our team has recently worked with community groups to help apply for that fund, so that's something our team can support them with for some of their applications if needed.
Just on that topic, it is really important if you've got volunteer groups in low socioeconomic areas filling out application forms that require, a lot of wordy spin, basically. They are at a huge disadvantage, and the same with the reporting back. You do want to make these funds accessible to those who really need them.
Yes, I agree completely. And I would say, because I do capability building across the country, that is an absolute fact that organisations, those sort of organisations are at a disadvantage. So it's really about building the capability, and if council can do that, it will be useful for them for these council funds, but it will also be useful for them about how they strategically think about their organisation and the other funders they go to, because I totally agree with you.
Is it worth building in some steps? Like if you want up to $2,500, this is the process. If you want between 2 and 10, then we want a bit more info.
Well, I think that would sit in the criteria of the actual fund. So I think when you look at the funds, that is something that you'd need to be really clear on, so that organisations knew that if they're applying for a certain fund for a certain amount of money, here are the expectations that they're going to need to meet.
It's just I was tied up with a group earlier in the year that decided, hey, let's do something.
Yeah.
But we need some funding for a location. They were going to get a whole lot of other people on board, but someone had to lead to get the venue funding going. And they had to turn up to a training time at lunchtime to work out how to fill in a form and how to do it all. And they arrived and the person didn't. From council, and they had to go back and do all this stuff. And they only really wanted a net. And they're just a small community group. And it's like, well, do we want their activity to happen in our city or not?
And this is where council has probably a role to play here to really help them build capability. I mean, this is sort of a slight diversion, but I just would say my observation is, and not criticising any of these groups, because actually it's the fact that, most of these organisations, their sole purpose is not to fundraise, their sole purpose is to deliver services back to the community, and they're doing it with limited resources and huge volunteer base. So I think there's definitely a role here around capability building with council, and maybe the drop-in thing and someone not being there is not the ideal for that type of organisation. Maybe there's a better way, but I do think that it's not just about the fundraising that will help them be more successful. I think it helps them be more strategic as an organisation. Because there's really
Yep, I get it, but they weren't an organisation. They were a bunch of volunteers that wanted to do a one-off, and they didn't want capability building for the next few years and how they can grant fund. Well,
I think when you're asking for money, there's a bit of doing and right. There's a bit of, I think I also think there's responsibilities when you're getting funding. That's just my view.
I think what we're hearing there is applicable across the board, and it's that we want to remove barriers comparative to the value of the funding being sought.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
Councillor Crystal. Through the chair, thank you.
Yeah. Oh, thanks. I think one of the things that what Richard was talking about is that I don't think we do very well is these drop-in sessions for training. We advertise them, come and learn how to apply for a fund. If less than 3 people apply, we we cancel it. So, and I've heard this from people too, so I
Yes.
know exactly. So I think it's one of the things in here we do not do very well, and we certainly could do it better. And we run one for creative arts, we run one for community. You know, really it's the same principles in all of them.
Yes,
We
exactly.
don't need to do that. We just need to run a couple of really good ones a year where we get all the groups
Yes.
and do it well,
Yes.
rather than, and so I know the feedback from me, from people that have come to them, is they weren't very good.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we work with a lot of councils helping them do that, like running workshops for them once a year where they come and spend time. That's really useful. They've got a toolkit, they walk away and they've got the support, and it doesn't have to be sector driven. It doesn't matter whether you're arts, culture, whatever. The principles for fundraising are actually the same. But you've got to think about how you deliver that back to community groups. It's going to work for the community group, which is your point, isn't it?
It may be delivering that in a different way.
Absolutely.
Online tutorial rather than a sit down at 1 o'clock.
Or it could be a webinar that you've got that you record, and that's what we sometimes do, record a webinar, and then they can look at it at their own time, and then they could, there's different ways you can deliver that. But it's probably something for Margot and Roger to think about, and then really for delivery. So,
Councillor McGrath.
Through the chair.
Thank you.
We were talking earlier about not getting people reliant on our money. Yet we're trying to upskill them to keep coming back.
No, well, I think what works, and just we're sort of going off topic here, so I'll just quickly answer it and get back to this. But I think how the councils that I work with in this space is that it's not just about helping them get money out of council. The workshops that we run with them are more about saying council is part of the picture potentially, but may not necessarily be money. It could be that council's endorsing and giving them letters of support or helping them open doors or whatever. But it is part of a wider funding mix. So actually, what are you doing in terms of regular giving? What have you got a bequest program? Are you applying to lotteries? This is how you go to a gaming trust. So it's building capability across a range of funding sources, not just council, for exactly that reason. But there is such low capability out there in community groups. There really is. Even the ability to write an application letter, I can promise you, there's help required out there in that space. Okay, so I think we've got some good feedback around sort of the trends around the sort of impact, and I mean that sort of follows on to the next one. Is kind of understanding from you is, do you want your applications and your distributions to become more transparent? And I think we sort of kind of covered that off. That's a general agreement on that.
Absolutely.
The next question is, do you want to align the funding process with the annual budgetary process? And we've sort of talked about that a little bit actually, just in terms of when do you distribute funds? Do you have that a separate fund that, or do you do it twice a year? Do you do it once a year? Do you have a kind of a hybrid model, which you're talking about, whether there's that council policy still remains as it is, and so you've got opportunities to distribute funds at that point?
As much as possible, it would be good to be streamlined, but then keep a portion for flexibility, I suppose.
Councillor Crystal.
I think one of the things that does happen is to our annual plan and then long-term plan. That is where we often get people come, especially for the bigger funds. And it seems to be something that people kind of know that that is a time, they think in their head that's the time to come to us.
Yes.
And that's just something that I've observed, it's very, well, it's not as common to get them during the year as it is to get
right
at those at
yes
that time.
Councillor Bowe, did you include the fact that people come to our LTP hearings and annual plan and ask for money and we have some available? Is that on your list of funds available? What one's that?
Oh, sorry. No, that was really, no, it's not.
Projects fund.
It's a projects fund. That's where I sort of see that,
Oh, okay.
That's
but
where the money.
in terms of there is no actual kind of grant, there's no funding distribution that sort of sits, you don't have a fund that says, oh, it's LTP funding. It more sort of sits under that council project fund.
And what we would usually do at LTP is when we have those funding requests, we assign a funding source to them in our deliberations. So sometimes we refer them back to a funding process, or we refer them to a service level agreement conversation, or we refer them to council projects. I think it would be quite nice to move away from that so that you're considering, like I think what you're suggesting, that you're considering those budgets ahead of LTP at the same time as you have your applications, so that you don't need to essentially defer people from the LTP to somewhere else.
Yes.
Is that your feedback, Max?
It doesn't seem to be a finite amount necessarily, though. I think sometimes I've seen with our LTP, like how much money have we kind of got left over. There's been a sort of a discretionary decisions made, you know, with somebody or an organisation that wants to start something up, you know, wants a big donation for the regional park, for example, those sorts of things. We don't take that out of the council projects fund, do we? I thought this was all sort of what's in our back pocket in terms of.
Yeah, it's either from an existing budget, like an in-kind, or council projects fund has been the one. For instance, this last LTP, if we were to consider, which we declined in the end, the sports park or the PGA requests, they would have had to come from council projects fund.
Okay.
Yeah, through you, Madam Chair, I think something we have to be really careful about is politicisation of grant processes. And while councillors sit on the decision-making bodies, I think we have to actually be very careful and very clear about setting or changing the perception that people can come to the annual plan and demand money from us because it's a public forum. And I think we need to be really clear on proper fit-for-purpose processes that support you know, independent granting. You know.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting challenge that you've got, and I think it's something that should be addressed, because, and I think if you review your framework and you land on what the new opportunities are going to be for grant distribution, and then you've got a campaign out to your community around what that looks like, which could be coupled up with a capability support as well. If you were doing something like that, you're really trying to sort of say this is the process we've got, and that should help, I guess, get them transitioning them away from annual plan and LTP. But I think that whole thing about groups going to LTP processes, that happens across the country, doesn't it? I mean, you know, as councillors, you know, when it comes to LTP process, you're going to have these organisations. So giving them some clear guidelines around how it's changing as part of your awareness around what you're doing and getting that back out to community groups would be really useful.
Councillor Brown.
I think that touches on one of my points. I'll bring it up here. I'm not sure if you've got another line of questions, but
lots.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, everyone.
The questions I was thinking is, do we actually want to keep councillors on the selection process? Because it doesn't feel like necessarily governance decisions. Our governance role could be in setting the priorities, and then, as Max says, it's quite a lot of work for some people. So I think that's one of them.
Yes, actually, that's a good point. And I have to be honest and say that's not a question we've got in our questions. So thank you for raising that, because it would be good to get some feedback on that.
Councillor Greig.
Yeah, through the chair. I think that's actually probably quite a good idea, because I think we do risk nepotism. You know, the same groups get the money and then other people don't, and sort of like who's mates with who, and that would cut all that out, all that politics.
Except staff have biases too.
Well, yeah.
But yeah. But yeah.
It keeps you in the clear.
It's not elected people with biases.
I'm not sure we're de-risking any of that, and I'm not sure that is
We are our own reputation.
Yeah, a risk that's been identified with our current process. I don't think so. There's quite a bit of double checks and lots of parties involved. So yeah, I'd probably like to dispel nepotism as a risk that we're currently using. Councillor Bogue.
Yes, I think I would prefer to have a councillor or two on these committees, just to have that connection with staff. But one of the issues that has been raised and not really properly dealt with is how much do we pay the volunteers who come on those committees, because they spend a heck of a lot of time on applications, assessing applications.
Right.
And they get very little money from us for that. I know they do it out of the goodness of their heart. We as councillors don't get paid, but I think we need to look at upping the amount that we actually give these special people who are prepared to put time and, you know, have got an effort into these assessing applications, because it's very time consuming.
Yeah. What was that, Max?
Over 50 in the last round.
Over 50 hours.
50, yeah.
It is.
So that's something we'll note that, and Yeah.
We have had a chat with governance about that, and we will look at funding for people that do come to those meetings, and also potentially including preparation time, because it's not just at the meeting, they have to do a lot of work before they come to the meeting.
That's right.
Yeah, it's a lot, isn't it?
Absolutely, it is.
Yeah, acknowledging that, but from my perspective as well, there is a balance between people contributing to their city. So unless
Yeah.
we're getting unless we're getting a sort of lack of people to fill those roles, which may be a real concern, I think it does need to be quite cognizant that that is a volunteer role.
Yeah, and the conversation with governance is about having a consistent approach across all of our committee meetings.
Yeah, that's a good conversation to have. Councillor Crystal.
Through the chair. I agree with Maxine about having councillors on there, because sometimes there's things that come up that we kind of know and that are happening that community members don't, and so you really need those different points of view coming in, and it is quite, and we are actually also the reliable ones that turn up, because well, it's true, because half the time, you know, the community members, they don't turn up, or they all of a sudden they're sick, and so you need a quorum. So it is, because it is a volunteer thing. So I actually see that as long as you've got, you know, the people, the right ones on the committees, I think it actually works quite well.
Well, that's great. Thank you. It's good feedback. Final question I've got on this slide is from your point of view as councillors, what does success look like in terms of community grants distribution? What's important to you?
I think visibility is something that I'd like to say. So I don't necessarily think there's a consistent approach when we do fund activities to actually getting the visibility that the council, i.e. the people of Napier, have supported this in some way. And I think actually it's one of our touch points back with the community, or the priorities that we're putting money into. So I'd like to see some sort of consistency of visibility when council is supporting something, because that all goes to, like, we often talk about people don't connect in with council enough, but they connect in with these events and things that we're supporting. So it'd be great to build a greater connection there.
That's a good point.
Saw a hand over here, Councillor Brown.
I'd really like them to really bring out our priorities and our vision. So we've got enabling places and spaces where everyone wants to be. And I think there's two roles to the enabling. There's we provide the table is one, or we provide the venue, and the community are enabled to do whatever they want there. But also it's about enabling the community to create the places and spaces. And so I'd really love it, like looking at our strategic priorities, I'd love it in the next level of sort of strategic planning that we look at probably the three where it fits is within resilience, spaces and places for all, and visitor destination, whether we said to, like, if we carve out a part of what we're trying to achieve in each of those spaces and say, this is something that we'd love the community to lead on, and having funds where we can go out to the public and say, hey, tell us how you want to deliver better community connection, or tell us how you want to deliver great placemaking things, and having a fund that enables the community to do some of the mahi that typically they would have thought that we were responsible for. And if we were to go down that path, I think there would be, like, we could then look at freeing up some of our budgets that we've allocated to doing those things into that way around doing it. But yeah, I'd love to go out to the community and say, hey, how do you want to achieve these things? And we'll help you make it happen.
That's great. Thank you.
I love that. Like the proactive, rather than the we're sitting here with our bucket of money waiting for you to apply for it. But the hey, what can,
and that's about great. A partnership model, isn't it? As opposed to kind of what currently you've got, which is not across all funds, but across a lot of the funds, it's very transactional.
And sorry, just to round that out, the two other priorities that we have other than those three is a financially sustainable council. And to me, that, like a Rotary group, for example, can stick in a barbecue at about half the cost that we can as council. So that contributes to that priority. And then the other one is partnerships. And to me, that's us partnering with our community. So, yeah, sort of outsourcing.
What does success look like for you guys? That's the question on the table. Councillor Greig.
Yes, through the chair. So I think if community groups come back the next year with another event, but even bigger and better, we know it's been successful. For example, Matariki and Maraenui was just yesterday. The year before that, it was a small event. This year, it was a medium event. Next year, I think it's going to be massive, and they'll come back with more ideas. And I think that's a definite success.
Yeah.
Growth.
Cool.
Yeah.
Councillor Boak.
Something I'd like to add is that success to me would look as community organisations able to put together really positive and constructive and successful applications themselves, that our processes are such that they are accessible, that they can get assistance if required, and that it makes it easier for those on the assessment committee to say yay or nay, because it's a level playing field between those with, skilled wordsmiths making their applications, or professional people making applications, and those lower socioeconomic smaller groups that have got a huge amount to offer in terms of volunteer help and everything, and community-driven projects, that they get as much chance as the ones who've got professionals doing their applications.
Councillor Crystal.
I'd just say that, sum it up in the word you used right at the start, some transformation. That's what success looks like. Not the same old, same old.
I'd like to see us review our criteria and principles for application, what we see as what we want to happen. It's not the same old, same old. I think we need to really look at the criteria and what we're assessing the applicants against, because I don't think those have been reviewed for a very long time. And then that gives you they haven't. I know on the community, on the arts one, it's the same, but, and maybe we want to, and we have to grade against them, whereas maybe we want to look at other things and I think that's really important, that our criteria are quite strong, because then we know which way we're going.
Councillor Simpson.
Yeah. Following along those lines, the thought that was going through my mind is, are there any councils that are identifying an activity they see the community could deliver, and then go out like a tender process and go out and say, council would love the community to deliver this activity for the community, and
rewilding
effectively bids in to grant that process to occur? Are there anything like that?
I'm not aware of any that are doing that, but it's a great suggestion to think about, and I'll try and I'll do some digging and seeing what I can find out, and put that back into give some feedback on that, so you can understand. As I say, I'm not aware of it, but it could be going on. I can see how that model could be quite good.
And I think bouncing off that, it's kind of because rewilding was chucked out as an example of that, which is something we talked about and our LTP is doing within existing budgets. So it's actually about what Councillor Simpson's talking about, embedding that so community delivery into our work programs, so that it's not necessarily all done by staff. And that might not be a contestable fund, because it's our budgets for our staff to deliver something, but it could be a proactive approach for delivery, community delivery.
Yeah, and it aligns with that whole move that I'm hearing around the table, is around that sort of more of a partnership model, and how's council working with the not-for-profit sector.
Yeah.
And about achieving outcome.
Yes.
Finding out to achieve.
Yes.
Identifying a smooth process to have.
Enabling others to do.
That's it. Yes.
Yeah. Councillor Poke.
Something else I'd like to put in would be aligning our funding with some of our strategies, like our disability strategy, our positive ageing strategy, our multicultural strategy, even our housing strategy.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, and getting sending something out there, or making it part of the criteria, not necessarily compulsory, but just to try and link these things into the strategies that we're trying to put into effect.
I think that's a really good idea. I mean, you have strategies in place for a reason, so being able to and that will help you with your decision making around whether or not it is going to be a good return on investment. And I agree.
Great. Councillor Brown.
Another one, I suppose you could put it under the heading of sort of rationalisation of a market. So David Clapperton from the Eastern Community Central Trust gave a presentation at Unity Day, and he talked about sort of where they were heading with it. And he gave the example of, and you might know it's something to do with a bus that, like, there was all of these different community organisations who were trying to provide community transport essentially.
Yes.
And do you want to explain the example better than me?
Well, I think what he was trying to say is that there was a kind of a duplication of resources around around buses to get people to a particular place. It was to do with health, actually.
Yeah.
And actually, how they saw transformation was actually sort of reducing the duplication, having one particular bus that was well funded to get people to and from, and it was transformational in that community. Another example that David Clapperton uses, and I think where Eastern and Central going is a really exciting space for Hawke's Bay. One other thing that he talks about is being transformation. So transformation doesn't have to be on a large scale. Transformation can be small. We don't have to be thinking about big buildings all the time. It can be about sort of programs and what people are doing. And one of the examples he uses is a transformation that occurred in Mahia, where they put in basketball hoop on a pad of concrete, and so not massive, not huge amounts of money, but that was so transformational for that community because it got kids being active, got them off their phones and off their devices. They came together and they socialised together. So there were a whole lot of great things that happened for that investment, which wasn't huge, but it was transformational. So I think when we're talking about transformation, and this is part of probably what the education process and the awareness that you'll do out to your community group is sort of explaining to them that transformation happens on various levels. It doesn't have to be huge things. So thinking about sort of what Councillor Bogue's saying with some of those smaller community groups, they will be delivering transformation, and it's just helping them articulate that better.
See, I think the part that I really liked about it was that they had lots of people coming to them all looking for bus services, basically. And they were like, well, because they held the big picture, and I think we as council hold that role as well of seeing the big picture, they were able to go, well, you're only using it for school pickup times. The elderly could use it between 10 and 2 in the middle. And so they rationalised it down from, 5 buses down to 1 that works really well, and all of the outcomes are better met now. So
and there's a lot of duplication. I think we would possibly all agree that there is and part of also, I think part of changes to your framework and part of your awareness campaign could be around, how do these organisations work better together? Because there is so much duplication. There's only a small amount of money to go around. Don't start a new not-for-profit. Kind of work with what's going on in your community.
So maybe also, do we have a connector role there?
Yeah, there's possibly a connector role. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Okay. Just conscious of time. We've got till 3 o'clock, Margot. Is that correct? 3:30. Oh, fantastic. Well,
I need to shoot at 3.
Okay, right. Let's try and keep moving quickly.
Has it in the calendar till later.
Shall we make these quick fire? And I think if I say let's make them quick fire, we'll get this out to you, and feel free to feed any further feedback to Christine and I afterwards if we don't get into it today. So we do this sort of quick fire. But so I'm going to go through each of the grants, and I'm sort of going to ask you to sort of say yes, no, whatever. To where you're at. So the first one is the Community Development Fund. So this is a non-contestable fund. You've got the status quo, and I think I'm hearing from everybody in the room that status quo is not going to work in terms of how it's distribution, etc. You've got a couple of options. You can stick with what you've got. You can reduce or increase the funding, but it's been through LTP, so I think that's sort of locked in. The other option that you might want to think about is whether you combine this particular fund with the other community services fund, so it's one fund. You've got more transparency around distribution. So you make this fund, join the funds together, you make it contestable as a larger combined funding pool, and you're very clear out to your community around the process for accessing the funding and the criteria.
I'm seeing lots of nods for combining.
No, I'd say no.
Okay.
It's big enough as it is doing community service grants, and then to put this in it as well, it's a huge job for the assessment.
But we are looking at redoing that. So that's not part of this question as such. We're just talking about the funding quantum, whether we could combine it, and then lots of those operational considerations around how it's assessed, what that criteria looks like, how easy it is to determine if something meets would be a another consideration.
Okay, so it's not just one meeting with both of those grants put together?
Not as you currently know it.
No. I think what we're saying is that you've got two funds that are similar, but they are very inconsistent.
Yeah.
So would it be a better option, just putting this out to you for feedback, whether you combine both of those funds, you re-look at the criteria and you re-look at the criteria, making sure it's aligned to strategic priorities of the council. You're very clear on transparency, where the money goes, etc., how it's distributed. So that, because at the moment it's kind of almost a duplication as well within your own processes.
I've got Councillor Gregg, then Councillor Brown.
Oh, yes, through the chair. Just, that would simplify it. I think if we simplify, we have to make it better if it's simple.
Just wondering wondering what it would look like if we just took a total pool of our grants and sort of white papered it and went from first principles, what that would look like. Is that the process going forward, or are you, because this feels like if we're starting with what we've already got, this feels like a tweaking process.
Yeah.
What's the process?
Yeah. So what we are doing at the moment in terms of our scope is we are looking at what you've got, what you're currently working with. We've identified where the pain points are, and we're going to come back to you with what we see as really good recommendations. But we're really going to be guided by what your view is. You're dealing with the community groups.
Okay.
It's your money. We're going to be guided by you, but also put our own kind of lens across it from our viewers, sort of how this works in a funding sense.
Councillor Bogue, then Councillor Crystal.
One of the advantages of the community development grant as it is now, there's no time frame. You can just, it's something quite spontaneous, or you don't have to plan it out for a whole year. But I'm wondering if you were going to combine it with the community services grant, is that what you're talking
That's
about?
right,
Yeah.
yes.
Perhaps have two funding rounds a year.
That's what we were
Make it
thinking.
more accessible.
And make it more accessible so that, so we were thinking that if you combine these two funds, I've got written down here, having two funding rounds, so it would be 6
funding
monthly.
rounds.
Yep. But I think, and it would create a whole lot of, it would make it more transparent, it would make it fairer, more equitable to organisations. There's a whole lot of things that need to happen in terms of support to get these groups, in the space, and a whole lot of awareness. And if it was, and sort of we've tested this with council officers to sort of see, what would that look like? And I think the feedback we've got from council officers that twice a year is probably doable. Yeah, and I do think that sort of 6 monthly thing is quite important. Because 12 months is a long time, particularly if you've been declined, and or if you've had funding that they need match funding. Because often organisations are looking for match funding.
Whether you've got it or not as well.
Yeah.
And then it can tie into the report.
Because if I just flick to the next slide, which is a community grant.
Councillor Crystal.
Oh, sorry.
I just wanted to comment. I like combining them. I like the transparency because currently we don't have any vision over the development grants. But also, I think being able to give bigger grants within that space, because the 2,000 to 5,000, there's a gap in there between the projects fund and this of the kind of the 10 to 20,000 range, whatever, whether that, there might be things that fit in there. And so that fund then can become, from a bit more wider of what they give. Yeah.
The opportunities that have been.
Yeah, bigger opportunities.
Yes.
Yeah. So yeah, this is my.
You think 2 rounds?
Yeah, definitely 2 rounds. I said, yeah. Like the grad arts one.
Okay. So if I just flick to the next slide, which is probably helpful for you, so it's combining these two, the community services grants. So again, it's like you've just sort of said, it's a larger combined funding pool, helps again with fairness and equity. I mean, what we could do, and I haven't spoken to Anne or Margot and Roger about this, so just saying this on the hop may not work, but what we could potentially do is we'll come back with recommendations on what this could look like and then share it with you if that's okay. or take it back through to the staff and they can
I think
share
that
it with
makes
you.
a lot of sense, especially considering the feedback we've given today around those outcomes and objectives we
Yes.
need to see. We've done just give you some time to
Yes.
think about how you could manifest that into a
Yes.
system, and then you could probably have some of those questions answered, like hearing from councillors like Councillor Bogue who've been involved in it for a number of years around how that operationally might work.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And then you've got time to sort of consider that. So this isn't hard and fast. This is just to give us some sort of ideas about where we could potentially go, if that's okay. Okay.
Just one other point,
yes.
if I may, about combining them.
Yes.
One is hopelessly undersubscribed, the
Yes.
other one is oversubscribed. It just
Yes.
makes sense
Yes.
to put them together so that it's fairer and more equitable.
Exactly.
And the funding's actually being used.
Yes. Yes.
And I think that's the point. We've got that funding there, and the whole
Yeah.
point of it is to initiate outcome.
Exactly.
And if we're not giving the money away,
We're not
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, that's great. Thank you for that feedback. So then so I just sort of get into service level, service agreements. Sort of some key questions I've got here. So these are larger amounts of money that you're distributing. So generally with larger amounts of money, there's more accountability, I suppose, and more of a process. We just wondered, did you want to establish so as you know at the moment it's kind of not contestable, so it's the same sort of organisations that have historical relationships with the council. Do you kind of want to open that up? Do you want to sort of say, hey, we'll go through an expression of interest process, so to see what other organisations are there out there that may want to consider funding or not?
Councillor McGrath.
Just through the chair, and Anne may be able to help us with this. There was 9.
Yes. Yes.
Just rattle them off by heart.
No, I think I've got. Roger, can you?
I think I have.
Life Saving New Zealand.
Can.
I think I've got them.
Can, Napier Civic Choir,
Yep.
Random.
Surf Life Saving.
Life Saving,
Art Deco Trust.
Sport Hawke's Bay. Yeah,
Sport Hawke's Bay.
There's 2 RSAs.
2 RSAs. One. Naming community. Yeah.
Graver? No?
so can I just be reminded, are these on a rolling basis? What I mean by that,
3 yearly.
I know they're 3 yearly, but do all of those come up at the same time, or are they staggered over the term?
They all come up at the same time.
So it could easily become contestable.
Yes, and they all know that we're undergoing a review. So we rolled them over for 1 year recently, so they know that the review's coming up. So, they all know that there is a review going on.
Councillor Brown.
Looking that way. I think this is where we have potentially an opportunity to do some of that, like enabling of the community to do some of our work. For example, there's someone like Biodiversity Hawke's Bay. They could be an enabler of rewilding through a service agreement like this. So, yeah.
Councillor Grigg.
Yeah, through the chair. I think it would make a bit more healthy competition so that the others would actually know that they'd have to really prove that the worth of what they were doing. What do you think?
What's the question, sorry?
Well, just saying that it'd be more competition. I mean, like if there are more groups applying for it, the groups that we already had there, would we review them and go, look, is this delivering what we want? Or should we get another group?
I suppose that's the contestable question. You want to make it contestable.
Yeah.
I guess another way I could frame it to you is we would recommend an expression of interest process is quite a good way to go through. So you sort of and you can have a bit of a cull out, and obviously your officers, Margaret and Roger would go through and sort of say, well, are these organisations aligned to our strategic priorities? And then you would go to that next phase. Well, let's identify the ones that we're now going to say based on the alignment. These are the ones we're going to ask to come and submit a proposal. So you could have a 2-step process. So you're getting rid of the ones that don't align. They might think that they do, but they may not. And so you're not, so these organisations are not wasting a whole lot of their time and yours going through to the second phase. I mean, that's just that's generally what happens on those larger funds.
What I like about that expression of interest, and I'll come to Councillor Taylor, next is that it would allow you to explore that option of, do you think your organisation could deliver something that council currently delivers? So that more proactive conversation that we had earlier, it would allow for an expression of interest in that space, which would actually allow us to increase our number of service level agreements, moving from internal budgets to community delivered projects or activities. Councillor Taylor?
Yeah, I just wonder whether or not if you look at that sort of process, how when you go out for expressions of interest, you can have some categories of where you want some expression, because conflicted with Sport Hawke's Bay, but you'd have to say, well, is there a sport and rec, or is there an arts, is there an environmental, is there whatever that groups could apply for, and then proportion the money in some way to deal with all of those areas.
I think yes, it's a very good question. I think what you would do is you would have very strong criteria, and you'd have clear criteria around the types of sectors that are eligible for funding, and the type of organisation and the work kind of work that they're doing, or the services programs they're delivering back out into the community, what that might look like. I mean, in the same way, actually, to be perfectly honest, that with the new regional infrastructure fund that's recently been established, it's very clear criteria. There's a sort of expression of interest that you go through. They're very clear on what they're looking for to begin with, and then you go through a sort of a sifting through process. So I think that is an important thing. I mean, what you don't want is, as a council, I imagine you don't want 200 expressions of interest. So I think you need to sort of set the expectations up really clearly that there's certain funds for certain organisations, but for for what you want to do in terms of service agreements, that this is what you're looking for, and these are the types of organisations that could apply.
Councillor Simpson.
Yeah, I think further to, I think it was Maxine's point earlier, I think something we've got to be really clear about in our process is informing people that don't meet the criteria as early as possible, so that they can be declined early, or they have opportunity to modify their approach. In other words, they might be coming with a very narrow focus around what they think they're trying to achieve without really articulating the broad benefits. And I think we have to be clear that the earlier we can inform organisations that have applied that they haven't met the criteria, that might actually introduce greater opportunities for them to alter their application.
Yeah, there'll have to be strong alignment to what you're trying to achieve within that. Margot.
Just putting a different hat on, not my council hat, but as a person who has worked for community organisations in terms of service level agreements. If you can secure a service level agreement for 3 years as an organisation, it actually gives you a really clear and sure path to be able to deliver a program. So as a council, you can clearly see that if you're going to award those to people, you are actually probably far more likely to achieve your bang for your buck in terms of that these people have a really clear path that they're going to follow.
Yeah. Absolutely. And it gets them out of that 12-monthly cycle of coming around asking for funding again and wondering at month 9, heck, where's that money coming from for the next year?
It's also a tailoring of our overhead costs.
Yes. Yes, that's right.
Frequently we have to review these things, the lower our costs.
The other question I had here, but we possibly may have covered this off, is does council want to distribute funds via the LTP process or set up a process outside of that timing? And I think we've kind of covered that off if everyone's happy with that, unless you wanted to comment on that. And the third question is kind of redundant because you've been through the LTP and you are happy with budget allocation, so I can skip past that.
Bearing in mind we are open to existing budgets possibly being delivered in a different way. Yeah.
Yes.
So internal budgets.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you.
And through the chair, is that the existing budget rolling over year on year or with an inflationary increase?
I think it does roll over with an inflationary increase.
Yeah.
It does. Yep.
We wish to continue that part of it.
That's generally what happens with a lot of our OPEX, or a lot of our budgets. It does roll over with inflation.
I think we reconfirm it annual plan as well. They bring that revised one through. Yeah.
So my thoughts is we'll stick with what we have for this current financial year, and through this review we can look at potentially keeping the same number for year 2 and year 3, but figuring out how that might split across the grants.
Just one other thing, with the community services grant, there has been a formula of, I think it's $1.80 per citizen that's what the fund's been made up of, with some adjustments for inflation or whatever. Are you aware of that? It's a numerical formula. And is that still a good idea, or should we have a lump sum that's not tied to the number of citizens we have? Is
that per head of population calculation?
Yeah.
I don't know if that, I'm just jumping in here. I don't know if that, if other councils do it like that. I wonder if that's a historical thing. I'm not sure.
It is historical.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not aware of that, but I can look into it.
Okay.
It'd be interesting to see if we still do it that way. I haven't seen that we don't do it that way, but I also equally haven't heard us talk about it in a little while since it was upped. How long ago would that be, Max? About 4 or 5 years ago?
At
maybe?
least, yeah.
It'd be that long.
Yeah, it was quite a while ago.
It did get increased.
It did.
Yeah.
Yeah, from $1.50
Was
to
it
$1.80 or whatever per
something and went up.
It's not bad,
population.
filled on the census.
I got more people.
Should be done by.
Excuse me. And
Did you find it?
I did Councillor Taylor, would you mind
What?
sharing the rest of the meeting? Sorry, apologies.
thank you.
Wake up, TK. Wake up, mate.
I think the other thing just wanted to say here, and I know I'm kind of probably on repeat now, is that, these are non-contestable, so that's why we think the expression of interest is really important. And I guess the other thing that is important is that there's currently no transparency around which organisations hold these agreements. So that's something that you might want to think about. Can we make that more transparent? And I think that's really important for good governance and for organisations to know who has these agreements. And
Is that not part of the resolution and minutes of the LTP though? You said there's no transparency. I don't understand.
I'm not sure about that, but something that came out to me in the review document was that one of the service holders said they had no idea who else had them, which kind of meant that, well, they didn't even know if they'd be able to work together in partnership with any of these other organisations because they don't know who else has got them. So.
There is some transparency, as in a lot of things go through council meetings, but our website probably isn't as clear as it could be. So we can, while a lot of decisions are made publicly, we can make our website a bit clearer for people to
I mean,
have
it's
a
the
look.
same with any information, really, isn't it?
It's,
If you go digging, you'll find it.
it's like glimmerable, but it's in the detail.
Thank you. That's great. I'm just going to whip to this bit here, which is kind of, so we're sort of getting into sum up mode because we've got some really good feedback. Thank you. It's just sort of how do you sort of next steps, and what we want to do is be able to, if it's okay with you, Margaret and Roger and Anne, if we, put together suggested criteria and suggested recommendations for what the funds might look like based on your feedback today, come back to you and talk that through with you. There's some things that possibly also need to happen once you make a decision for change, if that's what you decide to do. It's really managing expectations with the community groups, and I think that's an important consideration. So making sure that you've got really strong communication out to the not-for-profit sector around the changes that you are making, why you are making them, and what the benefits are to the organisations for making the change. So that's really important. The other thing that you might want to think about is, are you capturing any of the in-kind support that you're currently delivering back out to the community? And I'm not sure whether that's the case or not, because I would imagine as a council, there's a whole lot of things that you're possibly doing that you're not actually necessarily accounting for. And it's part of your own storytelling that while you may not be giving cash to an organisation, you could be helping, as I mentioned earlier, with traffic management, access to council facilities, providing officer support to do certain things. So I think part of what you're saying is, hey, we are helping our community and we're doing that in a variety of ways. We're doing that through grants distribution. We do a whole lot of in-kind, et cetera, et cetera. So part of telling your story, and part of, I think, the move to change is about sort of saying we've reviewed our grants and we want to make sure that we are getting into more of a partnership model with our not-for-profit sector, and this is what that might look like. So it could be around about partnerships around how the funds are distributed. It could be, to your point, around how you might identify other opportunities where you can work together and you can kind of collaborate and encourage organisations to collaborate. It could be around building capability around how they tell their stories, get their funding, etc. So the capability building is really important, I think, particularly for, so what you won't want is organisations to feel that their funds are being taken away, and that's not what you're doing. It's really what you're trying to do is make it easier for them to access funds and make it fairer for them to be able to access funds.
Just through you. I think that it's very important, and people will be watching this at some stage or another, but it's very important to say that, you know, one of the rationales behind this is that some of our funds are very much oversubscribed and others are undersubscribed.
Yes.
And we want to give out all the funds we have in a fair and transparent way, and this is why we're making the changes. So we want the public to be more accessible on how to not only get funds, but where the funding is going and why.
Yes, yes. And I think part of that is if you're moving to more of a being really clear around distribution, linking to strategic priorities of council, talking about transformation and impact, that is also going to, because that's what every other funder in New Zealand is doing at the moment, and it will really help them get in a good headspace for their other applications or their other pitches into businesses or regular giving or whatever they might be doing. If they've got that intel and they know how to do that, it's going to help them with other funding that they're doing as well, because you want to be not necessarily the only funder at the table. You want to be part of a bigger picture there around strategic funding. And I think that's really interesting. If organisations, you know, teaching them how to talk about their impact in a way that's kind of compelling and short and sharp and succinct is really good for them internally to think about their planning and where they're heading it as an organisation. So it's all about sort of capability building in your community is important. And the other thing to just think about is, and this is not for necessary today, is just thinking about what your timing looks like for transition and, you know, making sure you've got enough time to bring your community with you, that you're alerting them to whatever changes may be agreed to, and when the transition might occur. So they're just sort of things to be thinking about as you're bubbling away with all of this, all of these new ideas and new processes. I mean, the point of doing it is that you want to make it better for the community.
Absolutely.
Which is the sole purpose of the review. Are there any questions? Is there anything that we haven't covered, or is there anything that you would like to share with Christine or I as we start pulling this together that you think we need to be aware of?
One thing with the service agreement people is that some of them come and present to us, because I know I've seen CAB and I've seen CAN. I don't think I've ever seen the RSAs or the Civic Choir, so I think that kind of should be a part of their service agreement, that we actually get them in a public forum to come back and, you know, report back, because there's some groups that are very good at that and some groups are non-existent.
Yes,
is that right?
The Civic Choir has, at one, I vaguely remember them coming in the last few years.
Did they sound good?
They sounded wonderfully. But they did, and it might have been that they came back for some extra funding.
Yeah.
Yes.
I know they applied to the
New-
creative arts, but I don't know if but I definitely haven't seen the RSA or community. Like, there's definitely some groups that I don't think we've ever heard from.
Yes, and I think you can say that to them in a way that they don't feel intimidated to come. For some people coming into, we're all used to council meetings, aren't we? But for some organisations, that's they're coming into an environment they're not necessarily comfortable. But you can make it in such a way that they feel confident to be able to come in, and you can help them with doing that. I think that's a really good idea. And I guess with anything, it's like if you're distributing funding, you have expectations of funds and how they're going to be distributed, and there's always an accountability back to the funder, and that's really important.
Making it contestable will help them being a little bit clearer with us.
Well, I think some of them think they have to. I know CAN do.
Yes.
So obviously there's some expectations with some that aren't given to others, or we just let them not. That's just, I know some know they have to come and present.
Yes.
Some don't.
Councillor Greg.
Oh, yes, through the chair. Are we actually reviewing these funding mechanisms every 3 years for the people that are receiving it on a 3-year rolling thing? Are we actually reviewing each one or not?
No.
Why not?
They do an accountability report, but we generally have rolled them over once they're in. They sort of seem to stay in, but we do look at it every 3 years.
Could we review that and actually review every single one? Because, I mean, otherwise we're not being transparent or accountable.
I mean, I know what you're saying, but talking about we've talked about these whole funds as being for good in community. A good example would be CAB, Citizens Vice Bureau.
Yeah.
They get rolled over every 3 years
Yeah.
because the service that they deliver to the community is outstanding.
Yep.
You know, just little things like that. So I hear what you're saying, but I mean, for the people that are actually in those service level agreements, the case that they've put to us and the case they continue to put to us is, in my opinion, worthy of continuing on with.
I don't think there's any question about the worth. It's that they report back to us, and we need to build a mechanism into the service agreements that says they report back to us, so we know the work that they are doing. You know, rather than just letting it flow and letting it flow. I think that's going to be part of what comes.
I think that's right. And the other thing that I think the benefit of these organisations coming back in, and it doesn't need to be in a scary way, so it's, you know, making them feel really comfortable, is that you really get to kind of, you as councillors as opposed to the officers, really kind of get to understand how great these organisations are. And it's about building, and this is something that I talk a lot about in the funding space, is it's about stewarding partnerships, and it's about really kind of understanding what they're doing, them kind of really understanding what your strategic priorities are, and you just don't know what can come out of those presentations and conversations around, well, what else could we be doing together? And actually, when you understand what they're doing, you could be connecting them with other groups, you could be talking to them about other opportunities. But if it's an application that just comes in and it's all on paper, you just don't get that kind of dynamic going on.
Councillor Brown, followed by Councillor Crystal.
You asked for considerations. I don't think this is actually for you, but maybe more ELT. I'm really keen to, I see our community grants and our granting as quite a strategic lever that we can pull to enable our strategic priorities. So it'd be great to see how this activity fits within our strategy for how we deliver our priorities.
Just back to the coming to present to us, an example of how that, when CAB came, they then invited us all. We went and had, or lots of us did, had a morning in CAB with them, seeing what they did. And that was a huge eye-opener for me to see the level of skill those volunteers have got, and this wide variety of quite sometimes very confronting inquiries that they get there. And we wouldn't have had that if they hadn't come and spoken to us. So yeah, I think that's quite important.
It is really important. And when I'm coaching not-for-profits about how they can be successful with getting money out of council, I say to them, invite your councillors into your backyard, because so that they can see the work that you're doing, because sometimes it's hard to articulate that on an application form, and they do probably so much more than we all realise in this room.
Councillor Simpson.
Yeah, through the chair, the word collaboration's come up a number of times. So looking back at our existing process and looking forward across any of our grant processes, do we actually question that? In other words, do we ask the applicants whether they see opportunities to collaborate with other organisations to make a more robust delivery, or is that something that we can squeeze into this process going forward?
You can definitely ask the question as part of the application form that organisations go through. And I know that there are funders out there that do want to understand. So for instance, lottery funding, for the larger lottery amounts, they kind of want to understand, well, who else are you working with in your community? What are the other stakeholders you've got a relationship with? What does that look like? I would just say here that I think it's really good to understand that, because actually that's good knowledge for your team, and also for them to think about, well, who else could they be working with? But probably that wouldn't be the drafting gate, that if you're not collaborating, you would miss out on money, because there's some organisations that it's just not possible for them to collaborate for a variety of reasons. But it's really good to understand where there is collaboration.
And actually open their thinking to opportunities as well.
Yes.
Councillor Bowes?
Through you, Mr. Chair. Just a comment that it would be good also to have our funding accessible, particularly to Māori, Pacific groups where English is their second language, because I think they're undersubscribed. So
I think you're absolutely right. So I can talk about that on a national level. So if I look at where, and there have been reports and data analysis been done on this, organisations that tend to have the greatest barriers for accessing funding are Māori, Pacifica and ethnic minority groups. And there's a whole lot of reasons for that. One is there can be language barriers. There's the whole whakamā about being really for some organisations, it's really hard to come in and ask for funding. That's not what they're used to doing. So there's definitely some, and their approach to getting funding, they need more hand holding and support within the organisation to help them do that. So I think that's something that should be definitely considered as part of, how the team works in that space.
That came through our review as well.
Yes.
That's something we're looking at.
Can we next steps from here?
Yeah, great. So next steps from here is that Christine and I will pull together some recommendations, and I think what we'll do, if it's all right with, I have to check this with Margot and Roger, but if it's all right, what we'll do is we'll come with some suggested sort of pathway forward and get your feedback on it, if that's okay. Or we don't necessarily have to present, but may come through Margot, however you want to do it. Get your feedback, and then if you're happy with that, we can lock it in and then talk about what the next steps might be. So if everyone's, I think we've got really good feedback from you all today. Thank you so much for being generous around that. I think we've got a lot, haven't we? It's given us a really clear direction, and there's a lot of consistency in the room, which was really good. So I think next steps are pretty straightforward. We'll come back with something for you to consider, and through Margot or Anne, and then we can nut it out and make sure everyone's happy with it, and then you just roll it out. Unless I'm jumping the gun here, Anne, sorry.
And I was just going to jump in quickly and say, so we will have a funding framework at the end of this that will be approved by council, but I think the next step might be another workshop just to make sure we're on the right track, because we discussed a lot today. I just want to thank Jenny and Kristen for coming to talk to us and being really clear about the funding situation in New Zealand, but also what other councils are doing and what we could do. And also a big thanks to Margot and Roger, who haven't been with us for very long, but they're already a very valuable asset for NCC, and they've sort of realised that we could be doing better. So that's why we have Jenny and Kristen here. So thanks to everyone.
Cool.
Thanks to you guys. It's been a long day.
Thank you.
Thank you,
so much.
Jen.
Really good.
Thank you.
Everybody for your participation, and you can go home now.
School's out.
All those that've got to go and pick up their children.